Hey, vinyl community and Beatles fans. So today I'm going to be doing a bit of a different kind of ranking video than I've ever done before. And in this video, I am going to be ranking the 5 individuals who I believe bear the most responsibility for breaking up the Beatles, from least responsible to most responsible. All of them in some way had a part in breaking up the Beatles, but I'm going to be ranking them from least responsible to what I feel is most responsible. Now, there's going to be Beatles scholars out there who disagree with this list or feel that one person deserves more blame or responsibility than another, but just in terms of the books that I've read, things that I've seen, documentaries that I've watched, the various sources of Beatle knowledge that I have come into contact with, this is my opinion. This is my personal list. If you feel differently, definitely feel free to share that in the comment section. But again, in terms of how I see it, this is the way my ranking falls. So number 5, George Harrison. Now, if you've seen the Get Back documentary, there's been no secret about the fact that George was becoming increasingly dissatisfied about his role within the band, not just the amount of space that his songs were getting on albums and singles, but also dissatisfaction with the way he was being treated by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who tended to still, even though George was coming up with some of the best songs that he had written to date, and in fact, to many people's opinion, he was writing songs that were better than some of the songs that John and Paul were bringing to the table. He was still being taken less than seriously as a songwriter and a guitarist by both John and Paul. As you can see, especially in the first episode of the Get Back documentary, particularly Paul McCartney, who George can never seem to play anything the right way. Paul is very much on his case about, well, can't you play it differently? Or he's not satisfied with the way George is playing guitar on his songs. There's the famous instance where Paul had asked George not to play guitar at all on Hey Jude, which rankled George's feathers. And Paul actually references that in the Get Back documentary in the context of that famous argument that they have in the episode 1 of the Get Back documentary. But nonetheless, George Harrison was definitely feeling stifled as a member of the Beatles. He was coming up with all these new songs, all these great songs, and was basically being elbowed out by some inferior McCartney tracks. Maxwell's Silver Hammer, for instance, some of John Lennon's compositions that were probably not as strong as some of George's compositions. You can definitely see some of that on the White Album, where George had demoed several different tracks, which didn't make it onto the White Album. And you have Revolution 9 on there. You have Why Don't We Do It in the Road, some other Wild Honey Pie, some other insubstantial Lennon and McCartney compositions that were put on the White Album that left no room for songs like Not Guilty, Sour Milk Sea, for instance. So there was definitely some resentment there that George had. So George, although he was not overtly responsible, he left the band, as you saw in the Get Back documentary, but he came back, fully participated in all of the band activities in 1969, and early 1970 was still putting finishing touches on the I Me Mine song with Ringo and Paul. And there are no indications that he ever gave in interviews that he hated being a Beatle, that he wanted to leave the band. He made no statement in 1969 or 1970 for that matter that I'm leaving the Beatles. So I feel very strongly that in spite of George's dissatisfaction, he would have continued on with the Beatles if the Beatles had continued to exist. Maybe not offering some of his best songs. I feel he still would have recorded a solo album regardless of what happened with the Beatles. But George, I think, also was not terribly disappointed when the Beatles broke up because it allowed him more freedom. He could pursue his own independent solo records and projects, and so it freed him in a way. But there was still that bit of George that contributed to the discontent that eventually led to the breakup of the Beatles, and I'll touch a little bit more on it as I go through my list. Number 4, Paul McCartney. Now, some would say Paul McCartney was entirely responsible for the breakup of the Beatles because it was his press release that accompanied the release of his first true solo album, McCartney, in May of 1970, where he said that he was taking a break from the Beatles, that he could not ever foresee the Lennon-McCartney partnership continuing on in the future. So he definitely was the one who kind of burst that bubble and made the announcement that, hey, the Beatles are breaking up. And also, Paul McCartney as well was not in favor of Alan Klein as a Beatles business manager. And he very famously refused to sign the contract to bring Alan Klein on as the Beatles business manager. And so he was partly responsible for that rift. He was also responsible, obviously, for some of the discontent that George was feeling, belittling George, not being satisfied with George's contributions to his songs, treating George as an inferior member of the Beatles. So I feel like Paul bears definitely responsibility. And Paul also sued the other 3 Beatles in 1971 to break away from the Alan Klein contract and to formally dissolve the Beatles partnership. So yeah, Paul definitely bears a large responsibility. However, to my way of thinking, it's not quite as large a responsibility as the remaining 3 individuals that I will discuss as part of this list. So, number 3, John Lennon. Now, John Lennon told the other Beatles at an Apple business meeting in September of 1969 that he was leaving the band. Alan Klein and the other 3 Beatles persuaded him not to go public with that announcement because they were in the middle of negotiating contracts with EMI and other business contracts, and they didn't want to spoil those negotiations. So John kept it under his hat, and then Paul blew the lid off of it with his announcement in May of 1970 that he was leaving the Beatles. However, there are a number of reasons why John bears a lot of responsibility, and number 1 was bringing Alan Klein into the fold, talking him up to Ringo and George, and creating a rift as far as what had always been a unified front that the Beatles had. The Beatles were always one for all and all for one, and there was unity there. And John Lennon, after talking with Alan Klein, bought his shtick hook, line, and sinker, and started the events which would eventually propel the Beatles into breaking up. He also, obviously, was responsible for immersing himself in his relationship with Yoko Ono to the detriment of the rest of the band. He was bringing her around to recording sessions, bringing her to band meetings, business meetings, where she was very vocal. John Lennon did not have to do that, but John Lennon was the one who invited her in, who said, she and I are one and the same. We're one. You talk to me, you talk to her. Wherever I go, she goes, and was definitely responsible for creating part of that rift. John had always been the de facto leader of the Beatles. And so when John said, I think we should go with Alan Klein, George and Ringo also followed suit and believed in John. There's a lot of complex issues that were going around surrounding the whole business arrangements in 1969, bringing on Alan Klein and some of the other things that transpired. But it was John, ultimately, in September of 1969, who had said, I've had enough. I want to do things with Yoko. He was feeling very invigorated after he had participated in the Toronto Rock and Roll Festival in the summer of 1969, where he had put together the first Plastic Ono band. He played live in front of a crowd. He felt so liberated, as it was, and actually had the courage to know that he could be successful as a solo artist and wanted to pursue that with Yoko. So I would say John bears more responsibility than Paul. However, not as much responsibility as the remaining two individuals. Number two, Yoko Ono, who has traditionally been the punching bag for people who blame her entirely for breaking up the Beatles, for meddling in the Beatles' affairs, for pushing her nose in where it didn't belong, for sitting in on all those recording sessions, for talking in John's ear and influencing him to break away from the Beatles. A lot of people have villainized her over the years as being the one responsible for the breakup of the Beatles. And it's very hard to know, was it intentional or was her presence and her involvement the catalyst for John realizing that he didn't need the other Beatles. He had now his new partner, his new wife, and he didn't need the Beatles as much as he needed them in the past. John, for the better part of the 60s, was very insecure, and he very much relied on that Beatles partnership to help pump him up, to help stoke his ego, to help him feel that he did have worth. And he felt very lost when he didn't have the Beatles, particularly when there was that sabbatical after the Beatles' last tour in 1966. He went off to film How I Won the War, but he felt very much adrift and lost at sea. He was in a very unsatisfying marriage. And the Beatles were something that helped ground him, helped him feel like he had worth. He had something to belong to, that he wasn't alone, that he wasn't worthless. A lot of his self-worth was tied up in the Beatles. And when he met Yoko Ono, he realized that he actually could have a life outside the Beatles. I think Yoko was very instrumental in helping give him that self-confidence that he needed, that yes, he actually was a genius and that he could get along very well without the Beatles. I don't know that she actively tried to break up the Beatles. I think Yoko felt very jealous of John's relationship with the other Beatles. And I think John, in turn, was very jealous of any woman that he had a relationship with. And so naturally, he wanted Yoko as close to him as much as possible. I think Yoko very much inserted herself where she wasn't necessarily welcome, didn't necessarily belong in terms of business meetings, band meetings, recording sessions. There's some evidence where she would offer criticism to the Beatles, in particular a song that they might be recording. She would offer some suggestions that were not asked for. So I think she definitely heightened the tension that was there, or that was developing already with the Beatles, particularly during the White Album session. And I think inserting herself like that, I think she definitely made it a John and Yoko versus the world kind of situation. So yeah, I think Yoko bears more culpability than the other individuals that I've listed so far on this list. But I think the jury is still out whether it was deliberate or whether it was just a byproduct of the fact that she gave John the confidence to separate himself from the Beatles and know that that would be successful. Number one, Alan Klein, Satan incarnate, the devil, the Antichrist, a snake oil salesman at the very least. Alan Klein has never been anything other than cast as the villain in the Beatles breakup, and rightly so. I am not sticking up for Alan Klein. He's number one on my list. And just a little bit of history on Alan Klein. Alan Klein, previous to managing the Beatles, also managed Sam Cooke and the Rolling Stones, and also did some financial management for some other British groups. But Sam Cooke, for starters, he screwed out of the royalties and publishing. He had Sam Cooke sign a contract. Sam Cooke was unaware that the language in the contract gave all of the rights to the publishing and royalties for his songs directly to Alan Klein's company, Abco. Sam Cooke died very shortly after Alan Klein took over management, but to this day, Sam Cooke's family and descendants do not have or are not getting any money from any of his songwriting, his royalties, any of the money from his publishing. It's just a shame, but he took advantage of Sam Cooke in the worst way. And the Rolling Stones as well. Early on in the Rolling Stones' career, he convinced the Rolling Stones to set up a tax shelter, and it was under the songwriting credit Nanker Felge. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, but basically it was a tax shelter that Alan Klein convinced the Rolling Stones to set up so that they would be sheltered from what was an extraordinary tax rate in the UK. And so the Rolling Stones set up this company, this publishing company. However, as most young bands do, did not read the contract and did not realize that Alan Klein would be taking all the money, all the royalties, all the publishing for that agreement. And the Rolling Stones to this day still do not get money or have the rights to any of the songs that they wrote prior to 1971. In fact, as Alan Klein was lobbying the Beatles to become their manager, the Rolling Stones had actually hired a London firm to conduct an audit of the financial dealings of Alan Klein, and they were on their way to getting Alan Klein out as co-manager of the Rolling Stones. You had Andrew Loog Oldham, who was their main manager, and then you had Alan Klein, who was their business manager. So Alan Klein was already a bad guy. But John Lennon in early 1969 gave an interview where he was talking about the financial trouble that Apple, the company, was in. And he was quoted as saying, if things continue on as they are, that the Beatles would be broke in 6 months. Well, Alan Klein, being the opportunist person that he is, read that article and decided, hey, you know who the Beatles need? And so he engaged in a very deliberate and very strong-willed, very strong-armed campaign to influence John Lennon that he needed to be the business manager of the Beatles. And you can see in the Get Back film where John talks about, oh, we've got this meeting with Alan Klein and I had to put it off, but now we're going to go meet with him. Well, Alan Klein had done his research. Alan Klein had read the Hunter Davies biography of the Beatles. He had read interviews. He had talked to members of the Rolling Stones. He did extensive research on the psychology and the dynamics of the band. And he knew that John Lennon felt inferiority and there was a rivalry with Paul McCartney, and that John Lennon had insecurity issues. And he knew going into that meeting with John Lennon that he needed to stroke John Lennon's ego. So he came very prepared to that meeting. He sat down and he went over with John, these are all the songs that you wrote, including one which was very contentious, Eleanor Rigby, which for all intents and purposes, according to all other accounts, John Lennon wrote very little of that song, but Alan Klein convinced John that he had written 80% of that song. And he showed John all the songs he had written and told him, listen, you are brilliant. You don't let that Paul McCartney tell you he's better than you are. You don't let him assert control over this band. And he definitely fed some of the insecurities that John had and made him suspicious with Paul. Now, Alan Klein knew that Paul's in-laws were also, Lee and John Eastman were also interested in taking over as business managers for the Beatles. So Alan Klein knew that he needed to get the other three Beatles against Paul McCartney and outvote Paul McCartney. And who did he go to? The leader of the Beatles, who he knew if he could get John Lennon on his side, George and Ringo would follow suit. And there would be natural suspicion, because Lee and John Eastman were Paul McCartney's in-laws, that they would not be looking out for the other Beatles' interests as much as they would be looking out for Paul's interests. So nonetheless, Alan Klein stoked all of John's insecurities, his suspicions, his doubts, and pumped up his ego. And going out of that meeting, as John said in the Get Back, he was so blown away. He knew things about me, that he knew things about us that nobody else knows. I mean, you can hear him talking in the Get Back, just how impressed he was with Alan Klein. But Alan Klein was a snake, and Alan Klein knew exactly what he was doing. And Alan Klein forged that rift between John and Ringo and George and Paul McCartney, which festered throughout 1969. Paul refused to sign the contract to bring Klein on board after George and Ringo said, yes, we're following with John and we want Klein to take over as our manager. And that basically sowed the seeds of discontent and led to the eventual breakup. Now, it was not Klein's intention to break up the Beatles, because that would certainly undermine any of the business dealings that he would do or his future as the Beatles manager. I mean, it makes no sense that he would deliberately try to break up a band that he was lobbying very hard to become the manager of. But I think very unintentionally, his campaign to get John and George and Ringo on his side to take over the Beatles ended up fracturing that Beatles relationship. So ultimately, and I know I've gone long-winded, ultimately, I lay the responsibility at the feet of Alan Klein, which is not to absolve any of the other individuals I've talked about in this video of their responsibility. But I think at the end of the day, if Alan Klein had not been involved, the Beatles might have continued on longer, possibly well into the 70s. Who knows? We can't rewrite history, so we'll never know. But just in terms of me, in my opinion, that's what I feel. Sorry this video has gone on a bit long, but that's the way I see it. Hope you're doing well, and take care.